Okay, so first of all, I'm not going to be exactly talking about the topic that was listed because I've noticed a lot of the topics that are going to be presented by others cover most of the applications. So instead, I think I'm going to be talking about more on the idea of what this field sort of contains and what is special about physicality in simulation and in LARP. What makes it special, what we have to take into consideration and so forth. And feel free to interrupt me during this. I sort of want to discuss things instead of just lecturing on them. Okay, a quick look at sort of what I do and who I am. I work as a city servant most of the time, so I'm in charge of digital education in one city, so LARP has very little to do with what I do there, and same with physical sims. But I'm also an assistant professor of management and organization, and there we look into strategy as a kind of playful process. And in that case, for example, what happens in the boardroom when the people are engaged in strategizing and they're physically present, so a lot of the thing comes actually from physical cues and so forth. Suddenly the field of studying physical role-playing becomes very relevant to what I do, even though we talk a lot about digital stuff. And then I'm sort of an adjunct professor, which in Finland means being ranked as a full professor, but just not without any position anywhere. Sort of a permanent status of having an academic rank equal to a professor. Yeah. And I edit alongside two people, one of whom is an expert on medical simulations. The oldest existing game studies journal, Simulation and Gaming, which has a central focus on especially educational and social applications of games and simulations, but it's also open for recreational gaming as long as there is some sort of special point on educational use for those or what people learn in them. Plus there's some other stuff, but I sort of don't want to be there too long. Instead, I'm going to go into the actual points. First of all, I want to mention that all of the pictures have simply been gained by fair use, so I have not secured rights for these from every person, but these are from the game's promotional site, so you can find them easily yourselves. So my topic basically is going to be on the influence that physicality has for simulations and their siblings, and I'm going to be talking intermixedly about players and participants and so on, because for me all sorts of simulations are kinds of games. Wendell Bell wrote in '97 that as soon as we introduce a human element to any simulation, it effectively becomes a game. I don't necessarily agree, and game definitions are kind of words I'm not going to open here, but basically we become playful in a sense as soon as we enter a human element into a kind of simulation instead of just running numbers or schematics through it. And this is important for everything that I'm going to be mentioning here. And I use an eclectic collection of disciplines and fields, sort of. If it works, then it explains the phenomenon, unless proven otherwise. Yeah, the Darmer's sort of axiom on science. And I'm looking into existing research and design. But for my first example, this is a picture from a LARP called Luminescence, where people were playing cancer patients, and they had a lot of flour available, and they were playing in their underwear and given the right to do what they want, basically, with the material. The only rule was that it's logical that it's there. It's diegetically real. No one will question the presence of this flour in the situation. And this is the kind of physicality that you can't get with any other method. You can feel the substances, you can get the reactions. Of course, this was an experimental art project, so what do we do with people who are in a certain mind state and then they enter playfulness with something that is not normally associated with play? Don't play with your food kind of thingy, but still. And I don't think there was really that much point per se to it, but as an experiment it sort of shows how much sort of we're missing if we're thinking about these things, sort of simulations as just something that is digital or technically augmented. So I'm going to talk about 4 key points. The first of all is that this is a long tradition, it has a wide history, the names are just very different from one situation to another. Second point is that when we're physically engaged in play or simulation, we are there, which affects us directly in ways that other forms of play or simulation cannot do. But at the same time, it limits our vision in many ways. And rules are friends in this situation. They enable us to do things that we could not otherwise accomplish. But at the same time, they are enemies to the experience of being there. And finally, this is a very complex tool, something which people often forget, especially if they talk about, let's say, political live-action role-playing. There's a lot of complexity. You can't control all the variables, and it's imprecise. Stealth learning can be guaranteed, but what people are actually learning is a completely different thing. And finally, they're great. And I'll return to these points later on. This picture here is another illustration of sort of the sense of physicality. Anyone recognize where this is from? A couple? Can you?
Totem.
Yes, this is workshop for a mythical history lab called Totem, where they chose to choose how people would... Can we get the front lights on?
Oh, yeah.
Looks a lot better if you can actually see it. So they're using a system called Ars Ordo, and the idea is to sort of show dominance through staring and screaming and so forth. And before the game began, everyone had their characters, and they established the hierarchy of the tribe using this method, sort of stare downs physically between the players, creating a sense of actually, I am afraid of this person, and so forth, sort of making it something that's in the back of your head instead of just something that you read on the paper. I mean, it's a surprisingly effective technique to establish something in advance through actually playing the situation out instead of handing it to people. Okay, about the tradition first. So when we talk about simulations these days, it's mostly associated with anything that is digital. And it comes from the tradition that 2/3 of the sort of classical approaches in this area have been strongly digitized. And these are, of course, military and business simulations. The third one has always been more flexible, which some of us just witnessed upstairs. But in general, sort of, like with recreational gaming, when you say game studies or gameplay, people think about digital games. Same with here. But if we look into classical research on educational simulations, there's stuff from the 50s to the 80s that always speaks of role play, of the necessity of having people being physically there, feeling the press of their own hands or on something, getting not necessarily a physical memory imprint of something, but the sense of what it would actually feel like. The roots of this are in several places. Military exercises, crisis management, these are the normally sort of name dropped. My favorite route is the practices of the so-called hellfire clubs in the 19th century, where people were recreationally role-playing through characters, religious rituals, just for the fun of it. Or apparently in order to have excuses to look at undressed women or something like that. because it was not proper for Victorian gentlemen. But also historical reenactment is something that has played a large role, because if we look into the histories of educational deployments of physical simulation, individuals who were present in reenactment organizations keep popping up. They have been inspired by hobbies in order to implement strategies that are then used in more serious contexts. And vice versa, so we see some influx of, for example, standardized patient techniques in other forms of role-playing. It's a recent development, but it's coming there. Same with psychodrama, sociodrama techniques, bibliodrama into edu-larping and so forth. So there is a lot of intermixture here. So increasingly, done in fields I've already mentioned. And one thing that is important to realize is that even when people are playing in fantasy games, the real world always acts as a referent. Even when we are doing something like playing abstract concepts in a dream arc or something like that, we're drawing on physicality. The Dutch senior researcher on simulation, Jan Klabbers, has argued that even in games that are completely digital or board games or something like that, we are still using our real-world experience, our visceral experiences as the key referent. It's our way of understanding things. So in a sense, techniques like LARP and physical simulation are actually the most natural to us in that sense, because we have access to a wider toolkit than we otherwise would.
You can let that my first comment.
Yes.
What do you mean by the real world?
He's trolling.
I'm not trolling, actually. I mean, Donald Hoffman and other people are now claiming that this thing that we call the real world is just a physically and biologically convenient sensory configuration that we use to maneuver through an otherwise incomprehensible space.
I'm here using it as shorthand for our prevailing sense of how we see the present reality in which we normally exist.
Excellent, thank you.
Which is the wrong answer, but it is how we function.
Right, exactly.
Which brings us to the problem that these kind of games, they bring the people into the action. You're really there, you're feeling it in one way or another if you are present in the situation. So it's easier to experience stuff the right way. The problem is it's also easier to experience stuff the wrong way. Those of you who have attended a live-action role-playing game that runs for several days, player exhaustion or hunger or something like that, it's very difficult to actually utilize that to make the experience better. It's what sort of kills the immersion for many. It can be done, but it's very tricky. This is part of the fact that when we're physically attending a simulation or role-playing, we're within a highly indexical environment. What we see is what we see. We have to sort of imagine less, we have to re-signify less what we are perceiving. And for example, the 360-degree illusion is one technique that has been used, sort of making as much of the play or simulation environment as realistic seeming as possible. But this creates the challenge that then if it's too close to reality, you start to look at the differences. So instead of finding commonalities and enjoying them, we enter this kind of almost an uncanny valley where we sort of get disturbed by the fact that now this piece isn't good enough. There's a point when you start to see the electrical wires on the poles, even if the fantasy environment in any other way is correct. Whether you let it disturb the experience or not is something else. Then there's the fog of LARP, which can also take place in smaller simulations. This is a concept by Eirik Fatland originally, comes from military theory and from the fog of war sort of the fact that information gets distorted when it is outside a person's area of perception. And of course in LARP we see this, for example, if someone defines that this building is now on fire, if the game master is not able to convey that information to the others, then when another group enters the area, the building is still there, and so forth. If someone says that the patient is dead and the other one says the patient is still alive, you're functioning with two different presets on how you would react, and so forth. So the information doesn't necessarily carry over. And this is also a mental issue in many ways, something which we do not, in especially educational roleplay, take that much into account. Means that we only see a part of the experience. In a movie, you can show that the bad guys really have feelings, or there's a reason to why they act in a certain way, but in a game or a certain kind of simulation, you don't. You just see the outward actions and appearances. So it's a personalized experience on one level, but at the same time, doesn't leave enough room for certain kind of interpretations, and can thus drop into the area of, for example, propaganda very strongly. So I know that people playing the oppressive soldiers have their own motives somewhere, but all I see is their activities, so it gives me a biased meaning. And then there is the trouble that we're always lacking information. Our knowledge of the world is always incomplete. In a fictional world, it's even more incomplete, because not all of the data exists, and it's possible that the organizers haven't told you all of the necessary information. And the trouble here is that you can't check for the missing information. This is what I actually wrote my PhD on. So the fact that whenever we're trying to keep up the fiction, we keep missing pieces of necessary information that we would need to keep up the fiction. However, any tool we use to get it, even inventing something ourselves, breaks this very same fiction for which we are there. So we're basically at a constant state of cognitive dissonance when we're playing, and we're just suspending our disbelief on sort of how it functions. This can be utilized in effective ways for educational purposes, because people are then more open to the information that the environment provides them. But it again requires certain kinds of tailoring, so to say. On the bright side, it makes it feel more interesting because there is the sense of novelty as well. So rules are our friends and our enemies. This is a picture from Hamlet. You bet it's more interesting to be inside that than to just look at the picture. So hooray for physical presence. We have a lot of heuristic techniques which sort of help or hinder our play. That's the same as in normal life. So we make assumptions based on others. This is why a lot of people use specific tools in specific situations, whether it's the right clothing for a simulation or the right armor and so forth, or signs of rank elsewhere. But this is also problematic in the sense that we're quick to make assumptions, for example, based on the appearance of a player and so forth, which leads to limits on who can play what or what seems plausible and so forth. So the same tricks that make it seem more real, again, are also those that limit what we can do. There's an excellent German article on this topic, so why we, for example, consider a short elf to be a problematic issue or so forth, so who gets to do what. I'll return to this. No, actually I'll mention it right away. So we have rules that make this possible, again, but every time we need to defer to rules in these situations to explain something, again, we're breaking the fiction in one sense. So in order to accommodate for everyone, we are also making it automatically somewhat less realistic. So we're always balancing on fidelity and indexical acceptance of all the facts versus the ability to make everyone feel safe, both mentally and physically, everyone being able to attend to play what they want or attend a training session for what they want, realism versus what is actually convenient. Running around in realistic armor for a week is heavy work. I see a lot of people nodding here. Yeah, and that's a part of the point as well. Sometimes you want to show how much exhaustion can have an effect. And again, same as with hunger, it can be used the right way. I've run training simulations where the whole point was to get people to repeat actions until sort of their strategy work became confused because of a lack of sleep and coffee and so forth. And the point was to sort of show at which point they drop into these convenience heuristics and so forth, or just nonsense, really. And it actually works, so you can use these again to the right way. Then there's genre optimization, because you often have to tell people, especially in recreational roleplay, what the expected play style is. Not just what the sort of concept is, what is actually expected of the situation. I once wrote a military game which was supposed to be sort of light and funny in tone, and my players all decided, without telling us the organizers, to approach it as ultra-realistic style. So instead of having character interactions, they did their patrol rounds and then went to sleep and so forth, and did not discuss anything with each other. Highly professional, and they were effective, but was it a good game? I think not. There's an article about it in which we call it the magnificent failure. And we as organizers thought everyone hated what we were doing, and then they were telling us, why did you stop the game at this point? We were having such fun. Yeah. Same with Bleed. The games are in sort of designed to always, and simulations as well, to sort of influence the player through the character and vice versa. We're actually doing this all the time, even though we were only lately talking about this intentional influencing. It's one of the most important techniques that we have. And physicality is one key component, because then you can experience stuff that you otherwise would not have. It also shortens the exposure needed to affect the participant through the fictional character, or the other way around, because you have more senses you can access. Again, you can use techniques to go the other way, but in general, physicality sort of feeds into it to the extent at which inconvenience sets in. This is a tricky tool in the sense that we can sort of set what is probably going to happen. But since we can't usually micromanage any physical setting of play, and the larger they become, the more difficult it is. It means that sort of we're creating a paper plane as best as we can, and then we're throwing it into the air, where other people are going to throw stuff at it or blow some air at it or something like that. It's beyond our control. We can try to adjust its course, but really the best trick is to prepare in advance as well as possible, and then sort of hope for the best. It's where this tool excels as well, because you have actual people doing actual things in sort of as realistic a manner as possible. So it gets very close to the feel of the activity in ways that others can't. But something that's really important to note at this point is that this is a tool that is not going to provide you with experiences, no matter what a lot of educational roleplay proponents, for example, say. staying as a refugee for a week and then experiences gives you a tiny glimpse of what the experience is. You have not experienced the life of a refugee or a homeless person or something like that, but it can give you a start for something else. So it's not an experience design, it's a glimpse design, I would say. And if we want real results, we need to ensure that there is a bleed effect, that the emotions and possibly also skills and other things stay along. And this is where debriefing becomes in as extremely important. Not just to sort of make sure people can come down from the experience they have had, but also because it means that the sort of intended interpretations remain and that they remain strongly enough in the situation. There's a nice game you can play with simulations or role-playing games where you sit down after something and come up with different interpretations of what happened. Were the orcs who attacked the king's carriage actually an expression on class warfare or something else? So I'm going to give this a Marxist interpretation. No, let's make it a feminist inclusive theory. No, let's make it an exclusivist feminist theory and so forth. So playing on it, and the person who gets the best wins a free beer from the others or something like that. There's a text called My Name is Jimbo the Orc, which contains this structure from 2007. I highly recommend it. It makes you also sensitive to how easy it is to construct different explanations of what just happened. And one sort of final point on the imposition of this tool is that it is easier for us almost always to create games or simulations about the exceptional. Conflict is more interesting than everyday life. And even if we want to sort of do this everyday life stuff, it's easier to set it in something special. So a live action role-playing game is likely to contain something like a wedding or a meeting or something like that, even when we're looking into what Stephanie Peck calls games of domestic realism. So this means that we sort of, to make it interesting, are usually downplaying the aspects that would be the most realistic. And instead we're looking for something that would create great glimpses, great experiences, or great photographs. So
why do you think that is? Why is it that we tend to be drawn to the exceptional, even if we're doing a realistic world? Why do we want a wedding as opposed to an everyday life experience?
Rituals, higher arousal and things like that sort of create more interest. And since we're usually using this to either drive a point in education where we need to sort of focus it and make sure motivation is high enough, or for an entertainment game or recreational activity, there has to be something for which the players pay and so forth. So it's easier to do that. Also, it's usually much more interesting to write. So from a design perspective, it's more rewarding to do the exceptional. Yeah.
But isn't that an assumption about how these games and designs have gone? To say that the universalization about LARP is going towards the exceptional versus the normal, isn't that a bit of a push?
I'm saying it's the current trend at the moment. So, but technically my point is not necessarily that whether this is good or bad, or whether this is the direction that things are going, but usually it's more easy to create something that contains points of interaction through that. Yes?
And I have a comment on what he just said. We also have a time limitation. You only have a certain amount of time to experience this LARP or whatever the simulation is. And things need to be taught, experiences need to be had during that time. So if you if you had a military LARP and 99% of your time was doing the normal things military does, which is sit around and wait, right? That 1% of combat would be a waste for people who paid money, and you wouldn't get that educational value. I mean, on the other point, if you had the 99% of actual combat and doing all that exciting stuff, they'd learn a lot more, they have a lot more fun, and whatnot. So that's like kind of the balance that I think everyone needs to achieve when doing something like that.
Yeah. One team in which I've been in, we experimented with making games that would be extremely boring for the characters, but interesting for the players who were present. Some attempts were more successful than others, but it can be done. Yes, Sarah?
I was just going to say that higher intensity tends to make people more engaged, so the more intense experiences that you can pack into the experience, the better. Although boredom can also create interesting play.
It feeds into narrative construction, which is important for some players. It creates conflict, which is important for others, and it feeds immersive mind states. Again, so if we're following John's classical system, then it feeds all three central player types. And
Yeah, so I found in making educational experiences for my psychiatric nursing class that the more intense the scenario was, the more likely to cause bleed, but also the more the students said they liked it. Even though it was upsetting to them, even though some students were so upset that they started crying, they talked for weeks about how amazing it was. So.
yeah, I've been toying around with the idea of the Finnish stereotypical male standardized patient. This is a person who doesn't seek medical care and then won't tell the doctor what the problem is.
That sounds like a Texan to me.
Yeah, we have some things in common. So you would sit an hour and a half in the same room with a person who has been instructed not to tell you anything. Yeah, I know, I'm running out of time. So in conclusion, I wrote this in the actual paper that there is, that the important things are the desire to do well, the knowledge and will to prepare properly, the self-awareness to know one's limits, strengths and desires, and the ability to throw oneself into combining all those in a natural manner. This is what we want to facilitate. In the article, I'm actually describing ultra runners with this phrase, but it applies here as well. So endure and drive to win. We want to feed these senses in order to sort of make the play feel right to people. This is another example from Totem. And here as well, when I see this picture, I would have wanted to be physically there. I would not want to have just watched a documentary or something like that. So this is a medium that draws us in and lets us feel something that the others won't. So that's it from me.
We have a little bit of time, maybe one or two questions.
Got a microphone if you need it.
David?
I feel like there's a bit of a fetishization of fidelity here. And it's not that fidelity, I'm not saying fidelity is a bad thing, but when it comes to educational LARP, I think we have a tendency to think only in simulationist terms, rather than thinking about how we can use, I'm going to use the word experience, but I don't mean it in the way you're talking about, how we can use the experience of LARP to evoke understanding of something rather than to simulate something that will evoke understanding, right?
Yeah.
Is there a space for that, or is that, are you talking about a particular genre of LARP here, or is this something that you think has been dealt with and we should be focusing on what you're talking about here? I'm not sure what
We have several other approaches as well. So my focus here is not on what is actually the optimal, but sort of what kind of things we should take into account. And as long as we acknowledge the limits and benefits of the fidelity that we can achieve through physicality, which is not as much as is usually claimed, then we can also toy around with it, starting with things like signaling of the existence of non-existing objects and so forth.
There's a tremendous advantage to psychomotor engagements that has nothing to do with fidelity, right? To being embodied and physical,
Yeah.
without being in a realistic environment, in the sense that it is supposed to be exactly what you're portraying, right? That has a metaphor, essentially.
It depends on what you're trying to do. So I did a
I-
edu-larp on de-escalation, which de-escalation is trying to get someone calm. All we used was actors trying to become agitated. And we trained students on how to talk to them, relax them. And the students loved it. They felt very immersed. They felt very involved in the scenario. And we had nothing, no props.
Yeah. Okay, we have time for one question, so it's fight between the two of you. I just want to say there are other advantages to physicality as well, which do not necessarily require role playing. So that's part of the focus here. Yes? Which one of the two of you?
You know, I was really interested in when you mentioned indexical environment, re-signifying what we're seeing as a concept. I'd just be interested to hear more about how you think of that notion.
That would be a very long lecture in itself. But in essence, sort of as soon as we engage in something that is fantasy around us, then we start re-signifying the environment one way or another, even if it's very close to what we're seeing.
And so versus like simulationist LARP, you're actually just re-indexing a physical object using the diogenesis of the game essentially to say something is something else. But
Or something is non-existent.
or something is non-existent, but there's still a physicality to that, which I think is different than a simulationist approach where everything is perfectly simulated, or, well, I guess this would be the very long lecture that we don't have time for.
Yeah, the brilliant journalist sitting right in front of you has written that it's impossible to fully depict everything perfectly. The impossibility of the 360-degree illusion. But we can return to this in hallway chats or something like that. Thank you for listening.